Welcome to the Organized Expat, brought to you by Tytle, the platform for expat taxes. Today we're going to talk about tax residency in France. And first of all, what is it and why is it important?
Yeah. So the relevance of tax residency is that if you are a tax resident in France, you have to file your worldwide income in France. So all capital gains or rental income, whatever abroad, even outside of France, you would have to report that.
Yeah.
If you're not a tax resident in France, but for example, somewhere else, then you only file French income sources in France. So that could be if you have an apartment in Paris, for example, maybe rental income. But if you live elsewhere, then that's an example of a French income source. But if you are a tax resident in France, and that's what we're going to look at, what are the criteria for that? Then you need to file your worldwide income. So that's the whole relevance of it, and also why countries have so many rules, and also so many rules between countries.
Okay, so as a tax resident, you file your worldwide income, and if you're a non-resident, then it's only about income that's specifically from that country that has to be reported. Okay, so that's the relevance of it. That's also the meaning of what tax residency means. But looking at the criteria, so when do you become a tax resident in France?
Right, so now we're looking at the criteria for France specifically, so under national law.
Because this is not universal. This changes per country.
Exactly. So this is just in the French tax code. So each country always defines their tax residency rules in their tax code. So it's different for each country. So in France, you can start with the question of physical presence. So where did you stay? And then you often hear the 183-day rule, which is 6 months. So if you stay more than 6 months in France, tax residency is more or less assumed. And even if you stay less than 183 days, but it's still, let's say your day count in France is still the highest of all countries. For example, if it's 5 months and then you spend the other 7 months over 7 other countries, then they may still argue, they may still claim that France is your tax residency, is your home. So that's the first one to look at.
And that's probably because they don't think it's fair that you pay taxes nowhere. So then they will consider you a tax resident even if you're in France less than 183 days.
Exactly. So it's just to say that even if you don't meet the 183 days, there's still a way of being a tax resident there. And then there are 3 other criteria as well. So the 183 days would already make you a tax resident, but there are also other ways of getting there, let's say. So you can look at the habitual abode, so your main home. So if France is your primary residence, even if you stayed less than 183 days, that's also a criterion to be a tax resident. And that doesn't mean that you need to have a home there. It's even if you rent a place in a hotel, for example.
So you're always staying at this hotel in Orléans, or it doesn't matter. So that could still be an habitual abode that you're creating.
It can be an accommodation, whatever. So that the habitual abode is more about where you spend your time. Then 3 is the principal place of professional activity. And what we mean by that is that if your main job, let's say, is in France, then they may also consider you a French tax resident. That's different if you have let's say a second or a third job in France, for example. Let's say if you live and work in Belgium, for example, and you have a very you just have another job in France, and if it's not your main job, then that doesn't qualify. It needs to be your principal place of professional activity. It's also a criterion you don't see that often in other countries' tax residency rules. That's what it's about. It's not even relevant where your employer is located, as long as you carry out the activities for that main job in France.
So it's about you and not about the company or where that's located or the employer.
Exactly. So you can look at is your professional life centered in France? If the answer is yes, okay, then you're a tax resident in France as well. And the fourth one is if you're a center of economic interest, as they call it, if that's in France. So then you can look at if the majority of your investments, bank accounts, business interest, if they're all in France, then the French tax authorities also consider you to be in France and a French tax resident.
So that's quite a few criteria that
exactly, and you have to meet only one to be a tax resident in France. So it's not that you have to meet all four.
No,
just one of them will already make you a tax resident of France. And of course, that also means that, some, for example, at center of economic interest, you can easily imagine that you then have that in France, but you actually live somewhere else. So then you enter situations where you can be a tax resident maybe of two countries at the same time. That's very common. Or maybe if you split your time between France and another country.
And what happens then if two countries both think that you're a tax resident?
Right. So this is what we call dual residency. And then you always look at the tax treaty. And the tax treaty has specific rules, just in case you have two residencies, two countries where you're considered a tax resident under national laws.
So let's say you're spending time in the UK and in France, so in two countries, and then there could be dual residency, and then you have to look at the France-UK tax treaty to see what happens next.
Exactly. And all those tax treaties, you have rules. You can call it a decision tree or a tiebreaker, but there are a few criterions that you look at. And they decide what your primary residency is, so that place where you will have to file your worldwide income. And those are, it depends on each tax treaty, but generally speaking, there are four. It's your permanent home.
And that's the most important one. So that's the first one to look at.
Yes. So then you check, okay, do you have a permanent home? So a home that is permanently available to you. That's the official wording in both France and in the UK. If the answer is yes, I have it in both countries, then you look at the next one. If the answer is no.
And if it's only that you have an apartment in Paris, but you have nothing in the UK,
then France likely wins the permanent home test. And then that shifts your tax residency, your primary tax residency, to France.
But it could also be that you have a permanent home in both countries, then it's a draw, and then you go on to the next question.
Exactly. And it can even be a bit of a gray area. So if you rent a place, for example, in both countries. So you can look, okay, maybe in one of the countries it's long stay, in the other one it's short stay. So there's a bit of discussion possible always. But generally the permanent home is the first question. So do you just have a home in France, and in the UK you stay in a few hotels, for example? That would likely make France your permanent home. So that would mean that your primary residency is in France. If not, if that's a draw, then you look at the second one, which is the center of vital interest. And then you look at your personal and economic ties to that country. And you basically make an analysis. Okay, what are my personal and economic ties in France versus the UK in this example? And in which countries to which country do you have stronger personal and economic ties?
So what could that be, for example?
You can think of family, for example. Where does your family live? Where is your income generated?
Bank accounts, maybe?
Yes, exactly. So the biggest ones are, I would say, family and job. And then there's also a lot of secondary criteria, like bank accounts, gym membership, etc. Driving license, for example. Healthcare insurance.
Okay, so that's the center of vital interests. And then if there's still a draw, so there's no clear winner based on permanent home or on center of vital interest, then you can go even further.
Yes. And then, so the third one is the habitual abode, which is also one of the four criteria in France's own residency rules. So the habitual abode is more about, okay, where do I spend my time? So if you spend 8 months in France and 4 months in the UK, then the habitual abode test would make France the winner there. And then you also stop looking, so you don't have to go to the fourth criterion. If you meet any of them, you basically stop the test.
Because you have a winner.
Because you have a winner, exactly. So this is habitual abode, okay, where do I spend my time? If that's also a draw, for example, if you spend 6 months in each country, or let's say over the last 5 years, it's more or less the same and there's not a clear winner, or over the last 2 years, for example, And then again, there can always be differences in each tax treaty. But the fourth one, the final one, would be to just look at nationality.
Yeah.
So if you're a UK citizen, if you're a French citizen, that would then decide it.
Yeah. But
normally it doesn't go as far.
Yeah, exactly, because it's quite unlikely that you have a permanent home in both countries, that you have your center of vital interest convincingly in both countries, that you that the habitual abode is 50-50.
Yeah.
And then you go on to nationality. That's quite unlikely, but still it's there in the treaty as the fourth criterion.
Exactly.
Okay, and last question, also I think important, and we get that question quite often. So when you or when should you register when should you register as a tax resident in France? Is there a specific moment that you should?
Yeah, it's basically when you move to France, let's say. So if you align that moment, if you leave your previous country, if you enter France, then you're expected to inform the French authorities. Or if you when you move there, when you begin earning income there, then you immediately notify the French authorities. That's also needed because there is not really a way for them of guessing that you move to France.
Yeah.
Because I mean, of course, within the EU you have the Schengen zone as well, so you can just go from Belgium to France, for example, and no one would know. So you have to actively notify the authorities. And then you get a French tax identification number. So that's the next step. So that's also small practical things. You register at municipality, etc. And then your tax residency also starts. So most of the times when people move to France, it's quite simple because they move from another country, for example, from the UK to France. Then they register, they do all the practical things. And from that moment onwards, they're considered a French tax resident. And then the year after, you file your first tax return in France.
Yeah, that's always the following year. And then I think in May, that's often when you file your tax return for the previous year. Okay, that's all clear. So thanks a lot for this explanation on tax residency in France. And to the listeners and viewers, hope to see you again next time. Bye.